When 49-year-old Joseph Schofield bid his farewells and left the Hare and Hounds public house just before midnight on Saturday 30th of September 1848, his walk back home that nearby under the shore would normally only take him around 10 minutes, but on this particular evening perhaps a little longer as he was slightly intoxicated. Making his way along Bury Road, Joseph headed towards Tootill Bridge, which was only around 200 yards from the public house. His house was a further 60 or 80 yards thereon from the bridge itself. As for the bridge, it passed over a footpath that over the years people of Brightmead had inadvertently made when making their way to and from their homes at under the shore, and it still stands at around 39 feet high from the base of the footpath to the road at the top of the bridge. Apart from the odd person lingering around outside and close to the Hare and Hounds public house, the walk home would be a quiet one for Joseph, but one he had done so on many occasions before. But something transpired during the early hours of the Sunday 1st of October that would ultimately end in tragedy for poor Joseph. Just after 5:30 that morning, a man named Robert Barlow, a collier who lived at Dorsliever and had been visiting his father, was making his way along the footpath that headed towards and underneath Tootill Bridge when he heard a groaning sound coming from somewhere close by. Standing still for a few moments, he couldn't see where the noise was coming from, and out of nowhere it appeared again. As his father was only a minute or so walk away at the croft of Messrs. Hollands & Co., he went back to fetch him. On their return to the spot where Robert had heard the groaning sound, and after looking around, they soon found the cause. Lying on his back and under the bridge, and with his feet hanging in the water, Joseph Schofield seemed to be in a pitiful state as Robert and his father made their way over to him. "Joseph, what art thou doing here?" asked Robert. Recognising the voice, Joseph in a wearied tone replied, "By Allah, is that thee?" "What art doing here?" Robert asked again. "I have been thrust over," replied Joseph. Robert and his father then proceeded to take hold of Joseph, taking care not to cause him any more harm to him, as it was clearly obvious to them that he was in a terrible state. They then carried him off to the croft where Robert's father was employed, and soon after, his father went off to quickly fetch some friends. An hour later, Robert's father returned with his friend Thomas Davis, and with them they had brought back a wheelbarrow. Padding it out with some old rags, they gently placed Joseph into it before transporting him to his home, which was only a few minutes away. His home was one of a humble character, and a home he had built himself from scratch. It consisted of just one single apartment measuring roughly 3 by 4 yards. Made out of stone, it was situated close to the river that ran under Tootill Bridge, and despite the odd occasion when unpleasant fumes arose from the brook, Joseph was content with living there. As for Joseph, he was just one of 22 children his mother had given birth to, and having been a widower for many years, he had lived with his sister Mary Davis since the death of his wife, and devoted his time to making his home his own castle. But he had also turned to drink, with the result being many of his friends and relatives disowning him, with some asking him to live apart from them. Such was his behaviour at times, something which was not the case before the loss of his wife. And yet, outside his circle of friends, he was commonly regarded as a friendly character who would offer his services to anyone in need. He was employed at nearby under the shore cotton mill by a man named Mr. Hazelden, and he would often be seen maintaining gardens for his neighbours. Back inside Joseph's home, Robert and his father applied warm bottles to help keep him settled, and after some time it seemed Joseph was beginning to feel better. Unbeknown to any of them, Joseph's injuries were far too severe for any amount of warm bottles to be of any help. And despite the help of his sister, Mary, as well as that of John Greenhouse, the innkeeper of the Hare and Hounds public house, who had heard of the attack and came to the house to offer his assistance, Joseph would sadly pass away shortly after 12:15 that afternoon. But before he passed away, he would inform his acquaintances as to the shocking events that took place that morning, and to him being found on the pathway in such a terrible state. Now it seems that shortly after leaving the Hare and Hounds pub, Joseph had managed to arrive safely back at home, but for whatever reason he decided to return back to the public house a couple of hours later. And it was around 2 o'clock in the morning when he would make his way back along Tootill Bridge. It's here Joseph was confronted by 2 men who demanded money from him. Refusing to hand over money to them, they then threatened him by saying they would throw him over the battlements of the bridge if he did not comply with their demands. Joseph stood his ground, but it was only when they grabbed him that realisation set in. Joseph begged the men to stop, but they carried on lifting him up past the wall, which was around 4 to 5 feet in height. At this point, Joseph asked the men not to throw him over, but instead to let him drop himself down. Now the drop below Joseph was, as we said, around 39 feet, high enough to cause even the strongest and fittest of men some form of injury. As he made his way over the side of the bridge, Joseph, it seems, clinged onto one of the coping stones only for a few seconds until he was struck on the hand with a blunt instrument of sorts. And losing his grip, Joseph could do nothing to prevent himself falling into the darkness, narrowly missing the brook and landing heavily onto the footpath below. Now, whilst retelling the events that had taken place, unfortunately for Joseph, none of his rescuers had given any thought to seeking help in the form of a doctor as soon as they had found him. Instead, Mr. Hampson, surgeon of Bolton, was only called for 3/4 of an hour before he passed away, but he did not arrive in time to offer any assistance. And the inquest into the death of Joseph Schofield took place on Wednesday, 4th of October 1848, and it was opened by Mr. W. S. Rutter, Esquire, within the Hare and Hounds public house, Brightmet. Robert Barlow would be the first to be called upon before the jury, and he will go into detail as to how he came across Joseph lying on the footpath on the Sunday morning, and how he had fetched help in the form of his father. John Greenhouse, innkeeper of the Hare and Hounds public house, would be next to be questioned. He would tell the jury of how Joseph had called at the inn just after 10 o'clock in the evening, having travelled back from Bolton. He continued saying that Joseph had knocked on the door, calling out, "Cattler!" and whilst he seemed to be in a merry mood, it didn't appear that Joseph was drunk at that time. A jury then interrupted, saying that Joseph had called at his house before that time in the evening, and he was half drunk by then, but Greenhouse would reply saying that Joseph now and again would act drunk when he was in fact sober. At the Hare and Hounds, Joseph paid a shilling for a pint of ale, putting the change from the shilling into his right-hand pocket. Joseph then spent the rest of the evening drinking and chatting with other people up until around 12 o'clock. At that point, Joseph asked Greenhouse if any others were leaving, but Greenhouse told him none were. It was extremely dark as Greenhouse helped Joseph outside, walking him into the middle of the road, and apart from a couple of people, he told Joseph, "There are none here that will hit thee." The next time Greenhouse would see Joseph would be the following morning and following on from the attack. "Joe, how is thou in this state? Did they not go on when I parted with thee?" asked Greenhouse. "I did," replied Joseph, "but I was coming again, and 2 men, and they ill-used me, that they threatened to throw me over the battlement of the bridge. I am killed, they have done for me," Joseph continued. Greenhouse would also recall hearing Joseph complaining about his back, and assumed something more serious had happened, possibly a broken back, and that Joseph himself knew he was dying. Joseph's sister, Mary Davis, would be next to be questioned, and she would tell the jury that Joseph had begged not to be thrown over the bridge, and that the 2 men were bad men. One of them was a middling big one, and the other was a small one. She asked which side he had dropped from, to which Joseph replied, "Joseph's street side." George Woolstenholme, Esquire, surgeon of Bolton, would be called to give evidence as to the injuries Joseph sustained and to the reasons why he had sadly died. From the post-mortem, his report was, externally, from right ear down to the collarbone, there was a severe bruise and a good deal of extravasation of the integuments. In the upper part of the right thigh and the groin, there were marks of severe bruises, and the skin was off the knuckles of the first 2 fingers of the right hand. The brain was perfectly healthy. The heart and lungs seemed to be healthy, but there was some bloody serum on the left side of the chest. The bowels appeared perfectly healthy, but on the lower part on the right side, corresponding with the bruise in the right groin, there was much extravasation on the perineum to which covers the bladder. The result, I think, of some severe external violence, probably a kick. It is not very easy for the groin to be hurt in that way from falling upon the flat ground. It might arise from falling upon a stone or some other lump. I examined him between the shoulders, and there found a bruise from 6 to 8 inches, and the first dorsal vertebrae was fractured. That I consider was the cause of death. A fall at the height that has been spoken of is very likely to produce it. His having been sensible after being taken home is quite consistent with a fracture of that part of the spine. I have never seen anyone recover of such a fracture, though persons injured in that way sometimes live 24 hours or longer. Richard Pilkington, one of the jurors, was also cross-examined and said, "I live close to the residence of the deceased. Between 1:30 and 2 o'clock on the Sunday morning, I was sat at the table with my son at my own house, when I heard the voice of the deceased. He was mumbling and singing as drunken men do. He came forward near my door and turned towards his own house. The curtain was part open, and I said to my son, we must shut this, or else he'll come in. I heard no more of him afterwards. The reason of my closing the curtain was that when he was drunk, he was not good to get quit of. He was apt to ramble about when in drink, from one company to another, and to be lost in that night time for a considerable number of hours. This he has told me himself. He could not always tell where he had been." Now perhaps the most important witness to come forward was that of John Smith, a young man who resided at Under the Shore, who recalled spotting 2 persons on the road home late on Saturday evening. He had overheard them talking about sovereigns and half-sovereigns, and that were going in the same direction as him. One of them, the taller of the two, stopped him and said, "My lad, we're awaying to Shappit," which he understood to mean they were going to rob the house of the nearby toll bar collector. The man carried on saying, "I know damn well thee doesn't know me." Smith replied, "No, I don't know you. I am a stranger about here, and I have a good way to go." The man repeated, "I know damn well thee doesn't know me," and Smith again replied, "I don't." The man then threatened Smith, saying, "If thee gives me a word, I'll do for thee too." It was dark, and Smith couldn't make out what clothes they were wearing, and he wouldn't recognise them if he saw them again. The coroner would close the inquest by asking the jury to consider whether an adjournment of the inquiry would lead to any important results. At present, there were two suspicious circumstances relating to this case, one of which was that of Joseph's pockets, which were turned inside out, and the other that Joseph himself gave an account which they had already heard. He told the jury that unless the two men met by Smith were loitering around, it did not seem likely that they had thrown Joseph over the bridge, as their being seen occurred an hour before the time that Mr. Pilkington heard Joseph near to his home. The jury, after a lengthy debate, would return an open verdict to the effect that Joseph had met with his death from a fracture of the spine, but by what means there was not sufficient evidence to show. But surprisingly, it's worth noting that some 6 to 8 months prior, a man named Robert Greenhouse, a painter from Amesworth, was thrown over the same bridge by the two men. Luckily for him, he fell into the water and sustained only a broken jawbone. This had occurred between 9 and 10 o'clock in the evening. So thank you very much for listening. I hope you enjoyed this story, and if you want more, please show some support and comment down below. You can follow me on Twitter as well as Instagram, as well as over on our YouTube channel, links to which are down below. But in the meantime, take care, and as always, I will be back soon with another tale from the past.